Hi, everybody. Welcome again to Fairy Tales, our study in fairy tale lore and legend and what fairy tales mean to us in the modern world. This is part 2 of our lecture series on fairy tales. And I want to pick off where we left off last time. It is really perhaps the single most important concept I'd like to stress to you about why fairy tales matter. Perhaps fairy tales matter more than any other kinds of stories that we write as human beings, for reasons we looked at last time and we will look at again this time. And also, I'd like to point out that maybe fairy tales are the most important stories for adults, too, not particularly or even especially for children. We spent a little bit of time last time discussing this concept. Well, think about the reactions of Jesus Christ to the children that were brought to him and how deftly Jesus related the kingdom of heaven to the mind of a child. If you want to enter the kingdom of heaven, Jesus said, you've got to enter it like a little child. That doesn't mean peeing your diapers and piddling on and dribbling on yourself. It means having the ability to wonder at things, to not become jaded. The things of this world, when we're little children, at some point the world impinges upon our cradles. It impinges upon our playrooms. It impinges upon our security as part of a family. And we realize that there are things like suffering and death, unfairness and injustice in the world. And the older we get, the more jaded many times we become about this, the less trusting, the less honest with our emotions, the less vulnerable we allow ourselves to be. We become hardened and calloused. And I think Jesus is right. If you become jaded, hardened, calloused, unable to see wonder in anything, unable to see people as wondrous creations made in the image of God anymore, you just see the anger, the frustration, the small-mindedness, and you get depressed by it. If you are jaded that way, how in the world can you have faith and wonder? Faith and wonder are two sides of the same coin. What is faith? It is the ability to wonder, magically filled with awe, wonder about those larger things that elude us in this world. And what then is wonder? Wonder is faith. That which you encounter in the world has goodness to it. And so that's basically the ethos of the fairy tale. And why children technically don't need them. Most children preserve that wonder. And when they get to the point where they no longer like fairy tales, that's almost always because they have begun to lose their wonder and are headed towards jaded adulthood. In that regard, in this definition, it is primarily we as adults who require fairy tales. We need them because they are the single most important thing we have outside of faith and scripture that reminds us about the wonder we used to have as kids, and that calls us back, as Jesus so adroitly does, calls us back to the mindset of children when dealing with spiritual matters. And so I'd like to talk today about a couple really towering figures. Start with G.K. Chesterton. G.K. Chesterton, Gilbert Keith Chesterton, is a fantastic Christian apologist. He is one of the, if not the greatest, Christian apologists of the 20th century, profoundly influential to people like C.S. Lewis, J.R.R. Tolkien, and many of the fairy tale dreamers of the 20th century. And Chesterton, of course, in his famous book Orthodoxy, written in 1908, very early, Chesterton was arguing in Orthodoxy, he was trying to come up with a work that explained not Christianity so much, but explained how one man found his way towards Christianity. Chesterton was an Anglican in 1908, and in a few decades, 15 years later, would actually have converted to Catholicism. And so he writes an Orthodoxy. He writes a book about coming to Christ that is equally viable, both in the Protestant and the Catholic faiths. And so with that in mind, it's really important to point out that the 4th chapter of Orthodoxy, this really beautiful apologetics for becoming Christian, very deep and moving and sublime, recommended highly. But the 4th chapter of Orthodoxy is actually a reflection on fairy tales. Chesterton recognizes the fairy tale elements of most of the Christian stories, and how this emphasis on wonder, this emphasis on bridging the gap between the fallen material world and that once upon a time in a world far, far away place that both Christ wants to bring us back home to and that fairy tales point to. So, interestingly, in the middle of one of the most influential books ever written on Christian apologetics, Chesterton includes an entire chapter on fairy tales. And I'd like to look at a little bit of what Chesterton says there about the nature of fairy tales. He titled the chapter, The Ethics of Elfland. Elfland, of course, being the land of the elves, the land of fairy, if you will, F-A-E-R-Y, the land of fairy, the land of fae, the land beyond our material rational understanding. It is the fairy tale world. And just like Tolkien would do a generation later, populated his fairy tale universe with elves, Chesterton, too, in The Ethics of Elfland, is trying to come up with an actual bona fide Christian ethics as they are applied to fairy stories, the Elfland of his title. And from The Ethics of Elfland in 1908, we have this wonderful observation about fairy tales and their importance. And this ties right into what Jesus, I think, was saying in the Gospels. My first and last philosophy, that which I believe in with unbroken certainty, I learnt in the nursery. I generally learnt it from a nurse, a nanny. That is, from the solemn and star-appointed priestesses at once of democracy and tradition. The things I believed most then in the nursery, the things I believe most now as an adult, are the things called fairy tales. They seem to me to be entirely reasonable things. And let's, before we move on to finish the quote, go back and look at that for a second. The very first philosophy, the very first understanding of higher order things I ever had, and this is true for so many of us, are the stories we're exposed to as children. The stories that moms and dads read to us, the stories we hear and encounter when sitting on grandpa's knee. My first and last philosophy, the older I get, Chesterton says, the more I fall back upon that philosophy I learned first. My first and last philosophy, that which I believe in with unbroken certainty, I learned from my nurse, my nanny. I generally learnt it from this nurse, and he calls these nannies, these whoever it is, the mother gooses who teach kids fairy stories, tell them these these tales of great morality but masked in wonder. He calls them star-appointed priestesses of both democracy and tradition. That was a wonderful observation, that the tradition of fairy tales, our heritage as spiritual creatures, our heritage that unites generation to generation, going all the way back in these tales of the metaphysical, these tales that supersede the rational and the human and the normal. In that regard, these mother gooses of storytelling, whether it's grandma or whether it's mama or whether it's nanny, they are priestesses. They hold the high keys to both democracy and tradition, the idea that we can be self-governing creatures, the idea that we, all of us, have within us the possibility of Elfland and its ethics. So both the traditions of democracy, democratic government, participation in government by all of us, not just by the elite and the nobility, and also the keeper of the key of tradition, which is fairy tales. So, the things I believed in most then are the things I believe in most now, Chesterton said. They are the things called fairy tales. They seem to me to be entirely reasonable things. We continue the quote. They are not fantasies. Compared with fairy tales, all other things are fantastic. And I think he makes a fantastic point here. The fairy tale endures. The moral values, the life lessons, the human wisdom and truth that are imparted through fairy tales, they exist from one generation to another. Fashions, manners, mores, worldviews, politics, they come and go. The things that occupy us today so deeply, the deep political divide in the country, the cultural rot that surrounds us, the vague fashion sense and technological obsession that we now have, those things in 100 years will have passed on to other things. The clothes we wear today, which seem perfectly normal, will look ridiculous. Hairstyles, fashions and makeup, hairstyle, and all the rest of it. It will all come and go. In this fantastical world we live in, the world of reality is really the fairy tale. And this makes sense. If there is a God in heaven, as we know there is, then heaven is eternity. That world is timeless and perfect and changeless. Our world is the one that's constantly fading away. It's not the fairy tale world. It's our world, our mundane work away, 9 to 5, seasons change. That world, that's the world that goes. And we're getting older, we're moving through, and before you know it, the next generation will be moving through as well. And they'll have little of us left, but they will still have Elfland. They will still have the land of fairy, which we all can commune across the generations. Back to the quote. Fairy tales are not fantasies. Compared with them, other stories, other realities are fantastical. Compared with fairy tales, religion and rationalism are both abnormal. When you look at the common sense, the logic, the enduring truth, the stripped bare truths of fairy tales that can be comprehended even by very small children, we realize that a default to organized human religion, the structure of religion, and rationalism, those who reject religion seek to deify the reason, human reason. Both of these things, Chesterton says, compared to fairy tales, seem to us to be abnormal. But he goes on to say, though religion is abnormally right and rationalism abnormally wrong. That's the genius of Chesterton. Religion, as it is confined in stone buildings with wooden pews, with very fallen human actors, religion is abnormal. It's not the ideal setting for the practice of our faith and spirituality. Do we really need those interpositions between us and the Lord? Having said that, religion is abnormally right in a fallen world where it is the best thing we have that's not called fairy tales to move us in the right direction. Rationalism, on the other hand, the belief there is no God, and consequently that the highest thing in the universe is reason, and we see this with the modern deification of science. There can be no greater gap than between the fairy tale world of our ancestors and how we taught our kids ethics, morals, values, and spirituality through the fairy tale, and the modern rationalization of science. We have deified science, and the more scientific and reasonable we claim to be becoming, the more we seem to reject fairy tales, the more we seem to make kids grow up sooner, the more we, instead of allowing kids to develop ethically, the ethics of Elfland, to let them develop morally and ethically and spiritually as children first, we are sexualizing them, we are plaguing them with propaganda like Al Gore's ridiculous movies in kindergarten about global catastrophe. It really is a shame. The more we default to reason, the more we lose the fairy tale world. So for Chesterton, if you go back to the quote, for Chesterton, religion, organized human religion, the human construct of religion, and rationalism are both abnormal. However, religion is abnormally right for a fallen world, and rationalism is exactly what you don't want. A deification of rationalism in a fallen world, that leads to very, very bad things. Fairyland, then, is nothing but the sunny country of common sense. Love that phrasing. Fairyland, whatever that is, wherever we go, and it could be in the stars, right? We mentioned last time about Star Wars in a galaxy far, far away. It could be across oceans on this planet. It can be in entire realms altogether, realms of pure imagination. We could leave our Earth and venture back to Middle Earth in the time of Tolkien's universe. It is an amazing thing, the universal applications of fairyland. That's why Chesterton calls it the sunny country of common sense. Between the two oftentimes absurd manifestations of religion and reason in the human realm. We move a little bit forward in the quotes from the Ethics of Elfland. Speaking again of fairy tales, Chesterton said, "If you happen to read fairy tales, you will observe that one idea runs from one end of them to the other. That every single fairy tale, classical, traditional, even modern fairy tale, is built around one idea that can be traced from the very beginning of them to the very end of them across cultures, across languages, across millennia. The same ideas run again and again. And what is that idea? If you happen to read fairy tales, you will observe that one idea runs from one end of them to the other. The idea that peace and happiness can only exist on some condition. This is where the modern world has lost its mind. This is where the modern world has really consciously sought to destroy the fairy tale under the guise of rationalism and common sense, what they would call common sense. Every fairy tale is built on prohibitions. You cannot eat the apple in the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden story in the book of Genesis is a fairy tale until it becomes a tragedy, right? And there is a prohibition. The prohibition is don't eat the apple. And to eat the apple is to usher in tragedy. And that's what we're talking about here. That happiness can only exist on some condition. We are so permissive. We don't like boundaries. We don't like discipline. We don't like to tell children no, let alone adults. And that breeds it, right? Look at the way if you want to understand where adult human beings are morally, look at what we do with our kids. if we prescribe no boundaries for our kids, if we would rather be our children's friend than their parent, if we decide that children know better than we do what their gender is at 5 and 6 years old, that know better than we do about what they should eat or how they should exist or how we should function in the world or what science should and shouldn't be used for, if that's true, then that reflects how we as adults want to be. We treat our kids the way we wish we were treated. And we want to be boundless. Boundless in our appetites, boundless in our material wants, boundless in our capacious greeds and lusts. We don't want to be hemmed in. We want to, like Nike commercials say, just do it and never reflect and think about it and assume there are no consequences for our behavior, our limitless, boundless behavior. Fairy tales, however, are exactly the opposite. Back when we used to really emphasize fairy tales for children, that's when grown-ups knew categorically that this world had to be bounded. If we didn't bind our appetites, let alone our desires, if we didn't bind them, we would find ourselves lost in very dark woods. Isn't this the message of Dante? You think about Dante in the Divine Comedy, the first book of which, in a way, it's one great, big, grand, glorious fairy tale. Dante is assigned to wander through hell, purgatory, and heaven before standing before the throne of God. It's all a vision in his mind that is presented to him. And so he is living in a fairy tale, one that has its horrors, like we saw last time we were together, the dark origins of fairy stories. That's hell, right? That's the hell of life. But there are purgatory, and then there is heaven, too. There are the higher places, the high countries, as C.S. Lewis called them, those places where we could go to see all of the suffering and the tears washed away in a very fairy tale ending. In the Divine Comedy, Dante begins lost in a dark wood. He's 35 years old. He's midway this white life we're born upon, 35 years old, walking through the woods. He has wandered into error like any of our Snow White, Red Riding Hood type heroines. He's got himself lost in the dark woods of sin. And he's going to need a guide to carry him through to the light. And that is the fairy tale narrative writ large again and again and again. Chesterton continues, "If you happen to read fairy tales, you will observe that one idea runs from one end of them to the other. The idea that peace and happiness can only exist on condition. You will have no peace in your life if you have no boundaries, if you have no ethical lines that you will not cross. You will not know peace, and you will certainly not know happiness without boundaries. And fairy tales are big, vast worlds that are nevertheless full of conditions. Don't eat the apple. Don't cross that river, right? It goes on in the fairy tale mentalities, right? Things that you cannot do, you must not do. Do not look in this mirror. These things can only exist on condition. This idea, which is at the core of all human ethics. All ethics, all morality is not based on what you are permitted to do, but what you ought not to do, which is exactly what we're trying to eradicate in our rationalistic, materialist world. What you should have no boundaries, right? You should have no hindrances. You want to pretend today you're a man and tomorrow you're a woman? We have to pretend that that's true and pass laws and change bathrooms and showers to accommodate your delusions. You are allowed to dream. You must dream as human beings. That is a fairy tale reality. But you can't dream endlessly and without logic or reason or boundaries. Go back to the quote there. This idea, which is at the core of all ethics and morality, is the core ethic of nursery tales, fairy tales. A few more quotes from Chesterton's Orthodoxy, 4th chapter, the Elfland, the ethics of Elfland. Fairy tales do not tell children that dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that dragons may be slain. That's really beautiful. Look, as I said at the beginning of the lecture here, to this hour, children don't necessarily need a lesson in wonder. They believe in boogeymen. They believe in Santa Claus. They believe in God. They believe in people. They believe in their mother and father. They believe in the wonder of seasons and snow and rain and sun. Children are created. And this is, to me, one of the great marks of the Creator. One of the most absolute marks of the Creator God in our lives. How do we know God exists? Well, look at kids. You would think that if evolution was the end-all and be-all of reality, why would children have evolved to be so innocent and wondrous? You would think that nature would have determined a long time ago that children, younger they are, the more vulnerable they are, the more susceptible to danger and destruction they are, the less little kids can defend themselves. Wouldn't you think if evolution was our only mistress, our only taskmaster, that evolution would have moved us in such a way to make children warier sooner? Of all the animal babies that are born, the human baby really takes the longest to be able to look after itself. Baby horses can stagger away after an hour or two. Many baby mammal animals are born with teeth or claws or unusual hearing. Human babies are at the most vulnerable things in the natural world, and they stay vulnerable longer than animals, quote-unquote animals of any other species. Having said that, the fact that wonder is so important to the life of a child, wonder sets the stage, a human child, and grounds the child, in the ability to believe and to have faith. Maybe that's why. That to me screams God's hand in the natural world more than almost anything else, that our kids they don't need lessons in wonder. Children don't need to be taught that dragons and witches and elves and Santa Clauses exist. They don't need that. But what they do need for fairy tales is that you can overcome a dragon, that the good things in life can be approached. They can be emulated. They can be moved toward. The bad things in our psychic realities, they can be killed. Greed and envy and selfishness and cynicism, hatred, these things can be slain. That's what children need to know. Whatever bogeys there exist in fairy tale worlds and all, it's a shame, isn't it, how modern storytellers, Hollywood, wants to eradicate the darker aspects from kids' stories. To tamp down ideas like death and suffering. It's funny, isn't it, that the same modernists who want children's stories to be free of traumatizing things like death and suffering and theology and religion have no problem sexualizing those same stories, right? It's kind of one of the great glaring hypocrisies of progressive rationalism. But we want kids to know that there are bogeys. That's one of the beautiful things about fairy tales. There are bogeys and dragons in the world. They both inside of us and our own psyches and in the world writ large, but they can be overcome with wonder and faith. Every fairy tale hero, I don't care who you name, overcomes obstacles, overcomes their bogeys with faith. Faith and the ability to continue to wonder when it seems impossible to wonder anymore. Go back to the quote. Immediately after that, Chesterton writes, "The poet. A poet is primarily somebody who works in the magical realm of language, whose imagination carries him away from reality. The poet only asks to get his head into the heavens. What a poet wants, and a fairy tale writer is a poet. What a poet wants is to simply get his mind, his imagination, into heavenly things, non-human things, non-earthly things. The poet only asks to get his head into the heavens. It is the logician, the rationalist, the scientist, who seeks to get the heavens into his head. Poets are wise. They don't believe for 1 second that in their myths, their fairy tales, their stories, that they're going to be able to encompass all of heaven and earth. The rationalist, on the other hand, the man who puts his faith not in faith or wonder, but in reason, that classifier, that scientific classifier of all things, seeks to get the whole of the universe between his temples. It's his head that splits. The rationalists, who thinks he can jam all of the natural world into his head, the head ends up splitting. But the poet, who only wants a bit of us, who wants to bring back a tiny little slice of heaven and make it ready for the drawing room or the nursery room, he's the real sane one, it seems to me, as Chesterton defined it. And if you look at the next quote we have assembled from Chesterton, this one sums up everything we've said so far. According to Chesterton, it is not earth that judges heaven, but heaven that judges the earth. That is a profound statement. How many of us, even those of us who are believers, Christians, how many of us believe or live our lives as if we on earth were able to judge the deeds of heaven? That we are not somehow subordinate. We become so wrapped up in our lives, our careers, our families, our wants, that we begin to question God. We begin to question the order of things. when things don't go the way we want them to, when we suffer or experience tragedy. Rather than growing from those things, overcoming suffering and tragedy through faith and perseverance and wonder, oftentimes we, as adults, become bitter and cynical and jaded and angry and ultimately despairing and ultimately rejecting the idea of God, because the world he has created is not the world we would have created for ourselves. That kind of narcissism. But it's not true. A simple pause and to think about the theology of Christ, the biblical, Judeo-Christian biblical values that are imparted from the book of Genesis all the way to the book of Revelations. We have to recognize that it is not the earth that judges heaven. We have no ability, no right to judge what heaven is. We have not that capacity. It is heaven that judges us. And that's a remarkably liberating thing to say. We can give up trying to decide where somebody's going to go when they're dead, try to arbitrate heaven and hell amongst ourselves, to absolve or condemn. We can limit ourselves to what we need to know, which is that there is a God in heaven and he is judging us. And so we live our lives according to the kind of faith and the kind of wonder and the kind of perseverance that we see modeled for us in little kids, but far too often we take away from children. And then when we get to be adults ourselves, we lose it, we throw it away. And so it's a remarkable thing. Go back to the quote. It is not earth that judges heaven, but heaven that judges the earth. So, for me at least, it was not earth that criticized Elfland, but Elfland that criticizes the earth. That's beautiful. If fairy tales are a portal, an entryway to a realm beyond the material realm, remember we used the word mythic to talk about this last week. Anytime you talk about the divine things, the spiritual things, the heavenly things, things that have no scientific empirical basis on this earth, you are engaging in mythic language, right? And Santa Claus is as mythic a character as any other fairy tale creature is. And so to talk about them, you engage in a mythic kind of language. If it's true that heaven judges earth, earth doesn't judge heaven, the same thing applies to fairy tales. It is not for the earthbound man. It is not for the rationalist, the jaded adult, the cynical politician. It is not for us in our fallen state to criticize the beautiful eternity of Elfland. Elfland, that fairy tale reality that springs directly from subcreation, humans creating in the way that God creates, it's Elfland that criticizes the earth. We should assess our morality not on the basis of our own reason or our own self-interest, but on those same values that are crystallized in our fairy worlds that are beautiful shards of the true light of the heavenly world. Elfland criticizes the earth. Chesterton says, I knew the magic beanstalk before I had ever tasted beans. I was sure of the man in the moon before I even knew the moon existed. Those primal stories, before we're allowed to stay out or travel far, before our feeble senses, eyes and hearing and scent, are very refined in us as little children, before we evolve or grow into clear-seeing, far-sighted, well-hearing adults. Those stories fill us. Those stories occupy us at our earliest years and are really formulary for us. On the basis of a well-raised child is faith and wonder itself. How do we instill wonder in kids? How do we keep it pristine in them? And these stories go a long way to that. I knew of the magic beanstalk before I knew what a bean was, and I knew the man in the moon before I ever could see or make out the actual moon. And that's where we lead to the next quote. Chesterton says, following up, we should always endeavor to wonder at the permanent thing, not at the mere exception. This is a shocking piece of moral philosophy. This is the ethic of Elfland. It's a beautiful statement, and one that nobody, as far as I could tell, nobody ever made it before. It was the argument that, why do we wonder at the odd thing? Why do we wonder at the eclipse, which happens once in 100 years, and not wonder about the sun that shines on us every day? Chesterton says, we should always endeavor to wonder at the permanent thing, not the mere exception. We should be startled by the sun, and not by the eclipse. We should wonder less at the earthquake and wonder more at the earth. And that, my friends, is the definitive statement of this jadedness I've been telling you, right? That why do just a few months ago we had this earthquake, right? Not this earthquake, we had those too, but we had this eclipse that people lost their minds. People were driving thousands of miles, little towns in the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest in the United States, where the eclipse was going to be able to be seen the best, the most clearly. You had towns of 2,000 and 3,000 people with 40, 70, 100,000 people descending upon them. Gasoline shortages, supplies, shelves were emptied, just so people could travel to see a simple eclipse. And Chesterton's right. We wonder at the marvel. We wonder at the exception. But that sun is with you every day. How have we come to take for granted the shining of the sun on a daily basis? Why do we concern ourselves more with the eclipsed sun than the daily wonder of the sun we see? Permanence, right? The fleeting thing captures our attention, not the permanent thing. Life is a fleeting thing. Heaven is a permanent one. Why in this earthly world are we distracted by the world all the time? And we can't see the permanent thing right behind it. If you go back to the quote, I think he phrases it beautifully. We should be startled by the sun in its permanence, not by the eclipse in its randomness. We should wonder less at the violent earthquake. Why does it take the shaking of the earth to wake us to attention? And we do not wonder more at the earth every day. All of its miracles and its myriad wonders, we take them for granted. People who live at the base, you know how it is. People who live at the base of the Rocky Mountains don't see the mountains anymore. People who come to live next to the beach, after a while, they stop seeing the ocean. This is true of us. This is what we are, right? We move to these or even more specifically, you find a favorite print of yours. Some artist has painted a picture, and you find a print and you frame it and you stick it on your wall. And for the first couple of days, you just look at it every time you can. You walk by it on the way to get a glass of milk, and you just pause for a second. And then within a week, it's as if you don't even see it anymore. It's there, playing your favorite song, downloading a recording of your favorite song and playing it 4, 5, 6 times over a couple of hours, couple weeks. Like anything else anymore. That's the nature. That's what we fall into as adults. How do we keep the wonder for the things that we love? And part of it is what Chesterton says. Wonder not about the new thing. Wonder not about the rare thing. Wonder about the wonders that you have with you every day. And those are your own kids, your family, the family dog, your husband, your wife, the ability to breathe the air, to freely go about your day, the ability to speak your mind. These are things that we should wonder more about, the permanent things, the permanent wonders, not the artificial ones. You go to the next quote from Chesterton. You can see G.K. Chesterton is a remarkable font of wisdom and a great Christian apologist, defending and promoting and arguing for Christ. And yet, how much of his apologetics is really rooted in an understanding of the fairy world, right? Of the ethics of Elfland, the fairy convention. He makes the argument: if seeds planted in the black earth can turn into such beautiful roses, what might not the heart of man become in its long journey to the stars? Right? Verily I say unto you, unless a grain of wheat fall to the ground and die, it will die alone, right? Unless it fall to the ground and die, it can't grow into something better. Those black seeds we put into the dark earth, if we cherish them and allow them to become what they were meant to be in that dark grave, they become beautiful roses. And if that's true of inanimate objects, seeds that grow into living things, roses, what would it be like? What can we imagine we're capable of growing into as human creatures, made in the image of God, as we move forward? That phrase there, if seeds in the black earth can turn into such beautiful roses, what might not the heart of man become in its long journey to the stars? And we move a little bit forward with him. A couple of great observations from Chesterton. How do you combat this worldliness and jadedness? Well, and again, when I say science here, I'm not suggesting to you that science is any way, shape, or form wicked. Science is altogether necessary, useful. It is a tremendous gift from God. It's a wonder in itself. We say the wonders of science, right? And we should mean that. Science has wrought wonders. The ability of human beings to apply their reasonable gifts from God to the natural world God made and to wonder at it and to create wonders is an amazing thing. But there is a danger. Reason has given us so many scientific marvels that we begin to wonder at science, not at the God who created both the scientist and the world he studies. What he says here about fighting rationalism is important. Chesterton says, science must not impose any philosophy any more than the telephone must tell us what to say. That's beautiful. Science can study the wonders of the universe. It can unravel secret, beautiful mysteries about creation, biology, chemistry. But the minute the scientist starts to philosophize about his discoveries, he has done a dangerous thing. Science should not, must not impose philosophy. That's what's happening with global warming, right? Scientists study climate. Some scientists come to certain conclusions, others, but almost all honest scientists acknowledge that there is so much more that we don't know than we do know about the modern climate situation. That's honest science. So the minute science tell us what you know, but the minute science then supports regimes, philosophical, cultural, sociological regimes, arguing for major global change without any assertable data, when the culture warriors get a hold of science and philosophize it to panic people or to force first world countries to behave like third world countries in the name of some weird social justice premise, not on the basis of any calculated science. When that happens, you see exactly what Chesterton's warning you about. Science should not philosophize to us. When science does, it's as if the telephone told us what to say, right? Telephone is a tool. Telephone is a wonderful tool created by science, applied application of human reason. It's a wonderful tool. But the minute the tool starts telling you what you will and will not say, that's when the tool has become a god, and it's dangerous. I love the next one. As a university professor, I can daily attest to the truth of it. Without education, we are in a horrible and deadly danger of taking educated people too seriously. That's right. Why do we need educations? And this is a tremendous fairy tale statement. Think about how didactic fairy tales are. That fairy tales, heroes and heroines, they have to make mistakes, or there'd be no fairy story. And they have to learn from those mistakes, or there would be no fairy tale endings. That's us, in a way. And what he says there is, why do most of us need education? It is to protect us from believing too literally what so-called educated people say. You've heard of the phrase, being educated beyond your intelligence? I think that's the kind of culture we've created. We've got kids in school from age 5 now to age, by the time it takes them 5 and 6 years to graduate college. We have kids in school from the time they're 5, in some instances, preschool. We have kids in school from the time they're 3 all the way until they're 24, 25 years old. That's assuming they don't go to graduate school. That's a huge, huge chunk of life dedicated to accruing meaningless academic credential after meaningless academic credential. I have met so many university professors with more alphabet soup after their names. I'm one of them, right? MA this, PhD that. What does it mean? It doesn't mean anything about intelligence. You stay in school long enough, they'll hand you a piece of paper. You pay a graduate program enough money, they'll give you a degree. It doesn't necessarily denote intelligence. Maybe all of us are owed a solid education so we know enough not to listen too carefully to what so-called educated experts are constantly telling us. I mean, how many times, how un-fairy tale is it? How many times in the course of your life have you been told that eggs have been good and bad and good again? A glass of wine will help hurt you. Cholesterol is this and that or the other thing, right? All the miracle things that we're going to fix problems that never fix them. Oat bran is the answer. Fish oil will solve all your cardio problems. It doesn't happen that way. And if you look at the limitations of science and how easily rationalistic scientific discourse is hijacked by non-scientists to make very non-scientific claims, you see the opposite of the fairy tale world working upon us. If we jump a little bit further, materialism. Christ, Chesterton, fairy tales, all have this in common, that the enemy is the world. The world's a wonderful place. There's much to wonder about in the world. There's much to love about the world. There's much to experience and be in awe of in the world. But be in awe of those things, not for themselves, but for the Creator they celebrate, the Creator whose fingerprint they are. That's the whole fairy tale message, that the material world is important and exists only to the degree that as it falls away, and it always falls away, it reveals greater and greater truths about God. I love this quote from Chesterton. I have remarked that the materialist, the person trapped only in material beliefs who thinks he's only an animal in an animal world, I have remarked that the materialist, like the madman, is in a prison, in the prison of one thought. These people seem to think it's singularly inspiring to keep on saying that the prison was very large. I mean, don't you just love it? All the Big Bang Theory types, right, who'll tell you that everything was dead. Everything living on the earth today arose somehow from dead things. And there was this great big bang in the sky. Depends upon who you ask. A couple years ago, it was 6 billion years ago. Now it's 14 billion years ago. Depending upon who you ask. Big bang in the sky. And that's all that there was. A dead universe, a quiet universe, a cold universe. And somehow we started to live somewhere down the scale. Nobody really knows for sure how, but it happened. The materialism of that is staggering. And the materialist will comfort you by saying, yeah, the universe is a big, large, dead place primarily. A big, large, sterile, dead place. However, just think about how darn big it is, as if that's a comfort, right? As if the prison, if that's all you've got, is the four walls of materialism. Does it really matter how big the walls are or how far apart? Does it really comfort us to learn that the empty universe is huge? I mean, would it make you feel better to be in a prison cell 1,000 miles wide by 1,000 miles wide? Would it make it any less a prison? It's the argument that Chesterton is making here. If all there is material reality, if we are just animals who flourish like flowers for a short time on this planet and then fade with the coming of the end, and that's the end of us, if that's all we are, then you are in a materialist prison house. The entire premise of fairy tales is to continually remind us that that is not what we are, that there is a permanent place for us and a permanent us that will exist on the other side, through the looking glass, down the rabbit hole, through, like C.S. Lewis said, through the closet, right? Through the wardrobe. There is always something else if you can get beyond your material prison house. Go back to the quote. I have remarked that the materialists, like the madmen, are in prison, in the prison of their one sole thought. These people seem to think that it is singularly inspiring to keep on hearing from materialists just how very big the universe prison is, as if the size of the scientific universe gave one no novelty. That's a beautiful point. Just because the universe is huge, it doesn't give us any novelty, any relief. There is no relief from its endless, repetitive monotony. Go to the second part of the quote. The cosmos, we're told, goes on and on forever, but not in its wildest constellation. Could there be anything really interesting to human beings? Oh, interesting from a scientific perspective? Sure. Interesting in terms of studying how suns implode upon themselves or the gaseous qualities that give rise to stars? Those are scientifically interesting things, but humanely interesting things about how we should live, why we live on this earth, what are our moral imperatives. The cosmos went on forever, but not in its wildest constellation. Could there be anything really humanely interesting? For instance, nothing like forgiveness or free will. The grandeur of infinity, of the secret of its cosmos, added nothing to it. The bigger the universe is, the less really humane redemption there is. Humane redemption there is. It's just an endless repetition of itself. It was like telling a prisoner in Reading jail that he would be glad to hear that the jail now covered half the county. Oh, guess what? You're a prisoner in your cell. We're going to make the cell as big as the state itself, right? We're going to make the cell 400 times larger than it is. You're still as limited as you ever were, but it's a bigger cell now, right? Move a little further. What's the answer then? What's the answer to the materialist prison house in which we find ourselves? For Chesterton, it's mysticism. What is mysticism? It's a fancy word to say the possibility of the mysterious. God is mysterious. God has revealed himself to us in limited ways, and it's for our own good. We, in the words of Jack Nicholson, we can't handle the full truth of God, right? We can't handle that truth. The truth of what God is way, way beyond our limited senses to understand, and it's way beyond our relatively small brains to fully grasp. How does the limited, finite human mind grasp infinity, grasp omniscience? God is never more loving than when he generously mediates his glory for our human wisdoms to get. Mysticism, that's all it is. That which is mysterious about God, about heaven, about life beyond the stars, about our own immortality, the soul's immortality in the dying body. Mysticism. Mysticism is what keeps men sane. As long as you have mystery, you have health. When you destroy mystery, you create morbidity and death. We don't need to be absolutely sure of the details of life. Not that we ever would be. We need to recognize that despite the numbers, despite the statistics, despite the subatomic workings of our bodily chemicals, that the mystery of life, the mystery of ourselves, is bigger, much greater than the sum of its parts. As long as we as human beings have mystery, and God is mystery, faith is mystery, heaven is mystery, as long as we have those things, we are healthy. It's only when you tell us we don't have them that we become morbid and sterile and nihilistic and self-destructive and suicidal. People who in despair take their lives, assuming they are mentally well, people who willfully take their lives are people who can no longer grasp any mystery beyond suffering or loneliness or despair and seek to end it. They're not getting rid of life, they're getting rid of mystery. Chesterton is right. We need mysticism, which is why we need God and why we need fairy tales. There is perhaps no better way God shares the mystical with us, particularly as children, but more necessarily as adults, than through these unique and remarkable stories. Oh, I'm sorry, finish that quote real quick, the end of it. Mysticism keeps men sane. As long as you have mystery, you have health. When you destroy mystery, you create morbidity. The ordinary person has always been sane because ordinary men and women have always been mystical. Well, if you don't work in a lab every day or you're, God help you, you're a college professor, most of us remain open to the mystical. Mystical people, ordinary people who believe in mysticism, they have allowed the twilight. I love that line, twilight. What is twilight? It's that hazy gray between the setting of the sun and darkness, or between darkness and the rising of the sun. It's that liminal space between light and dark. That's the fairy tale world. That's mysticism. That twilight, when it's not quite light, it's not quite dark, that's the time between those two universals, those two absolutes, that all things are possible, that gloaming twilight. It's a wonderful metaphor for the reality beyond our own. And if we jump ahead, Chesterton says, wonderful thinker, philosopher, talking about fairy tales, he says, it's interesting how much glass, Glass, it's interesting how much glass there are in fairy tales. This princess lives in a glass castle, that princess on a glass hill. This one sees all things in a mirror. One wears glass slippers, right? They all may live in glass houses if they refuse to throw stones. For Chesterton, this thin glitter of glass everywhere is itself the expression of the fact that the happiness is bright and brittle. Our happiness, why so much glass, shatterable glass in fairy tales? It's an expression, Chesterton says, a reminder to us of the fact that all human happiness is bright but brittle. It is like the substance most easily smashed by a housemaid or a cat. Our joy, our happiness, our self-worth, our contentment, our love is, as human creatures, brittle as glass. It's something that can be knocked over by a careless housemaid or a cat's tail knocking the glass off a table, right? Go ahead to the second part of the quote. And this fairy tale sentiment about glass, Chesterton says, it also sank into me and became my sentiment towards the whole world. I felt, and I still feel, that life itself is as bright as the diamond, but as brittle as the window pane. And when the heavens were compared to the terrible crystal, I can remember as a child shuddering. Remember all those wonderful old poets who called the heavens crystalline? Milton was one of the first to do it, right? The crystalline heavens. The idea that the heavenly realms are a beautiful crystal glass, cold and reflective and responsive. And you go back to the quote, and when it dawned on me, Chesterton says, that the heavens were compared to a terrible crystal, I remember shuddering. I was afraid that God would drop the cosmos with a crash. Remember, however, that to be breakable is not the same as to be perishable. Just because something breaks doesn't mean it dies. Strike a glass, and it will not endure an instant. Simply do not strike it, and it will endure 1,000 years. That's beautiful, right? A pane of glass, a beautiful stained glass window. Don't strike it, and it will endure for millennia. This thin sheet of glass will exist and exist and exist and exist. But all it takes to break it is one rock. It's remarkable how enduring it is, and yet how fragile. That's life, and that is exactly the border between fairy tale and reality, between faith and wonder, and realism and rationalism. It is that thin, brittle glass, our happiness, our love, our lives. How many times have you lost somebody quickly? Somebody that was alive one day and well, and the next day they had died, and it was like, whoa, how brittle. You come to the recognition how fragile life is. It doesn't dawn on you the rest of the time. If we wondered not about the rare thing, somebody dropping dead, but about the permanent thing, our lives, day in and day out, we'd be much better off. We'd live much more in that fairy tale world. The association, the argument about what glass means in fairy tales, one of Chesterton's more brilliant points, right? That when we recognize the brittleness of glass, that's one way of looking at it, but also the permanence of it, how quickly life, love, happiness, all those things can be taken from us. But with the right attitude and the right understanding of fairy, how long they can endure for us all of our lives. We jump ahead a little bit. Chesterton says, as we wind down our discussion of Chesterton's theorizing about fairy tales, why for children? Because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free. Therefore, they want things repeated and unchanged. Have you ever noticed this? Little kids, they want you to do it again and again and again, right? You pull a quarter out of their ear, you pluck their nose off their faces. Do it again, right? It's almost to the point of tedium. How many of us have gotten tired with our little grandkids or our kids bouncing the kid on the same knee or playing the same game of hide and go seek or the way kids will watch the same fairy tale movie, right? They'll watch Snow White or the Lion King, or they'll watch Beauty and the Beast again and again and again, to the point that you as an adult almost can't take it. He's got an interesting theory about that. He says because children have abounding vitality, because they are in spirit fierce and free, therefore they want things repeated and unchanged. Children always say, do it again. And the grown-up person does it again until he is nearly dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony. It's a beautiful sentence. Maybe little kids are stronger than us. When they find something that triggers their wonder, when they find something that makes them giggle and laugh and wonder, something that instills awe and the grasping for understanding in them, they want you to keep doing it. Maybe it's not monotony. Maybe the little kids are right. Maybe the little kids exult in the permanent, where we adults only exult in the rare, in the exotic. Go back to that. Children always say, do it again. And the grown-up person does it again until he is nearly dead. For grown-up people are not strong enough to exult in monotony. Maybe that's why we get divorced so often, right? Maybe that's why our eyes wander so much. But perhaps, Chesterton said, perhaps God is strong enough, like children, to exult in monotony. Think about it. Go to the next quote. It is possible that God says every morning, do it again to the sun, and every evening, do it again to the moon. It may not be automatic necessity that makes all daisies look alike. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, the exact same way, but he has never gotten tired of making them. It may be that God has the eternal appetite of the infant. For we have sinned and grown old, and our Father is younger than us. How's that for beautiful? God the Father has been around always, but he's younger than we are. He didn't get jaded. He didn't get jaded when the first generation sinned or the 400th generation sinned, and he won't be jaded when the thousandth generation of human beings has sinned. He won't. He wasn't jaded by the first murder, and he won't be jaded by the last one. In that, he is younger than us. He can see us live our lives from generation to generation, from youth to age, follow the same fallen patterns, and not get tired of loving us. Maybe the Father is younger than we are. Go back to the quote. He does the same things again. We get tired of them, right? When the little child says, do it again, but he does it every morning with the sun. He, do it again, moon, do it again. And the point about daisies, right? Now, daisies are beautiful, but they all look alike. And he made every one of them individually, one at a time. God makes the daisies like. It may be that God makes every daisy separately, but he has never got tired of making any one of them like we would. It may be that he has the eternal appetite of the child, which we need to get back to. For we have sinned and grown old. We no longer wonder. But our Father, thank God, is younger than we. Go to the next quote. This is where we'll wrap it up today. And again, what we're going to do next time, the last two segments, is we're going to look very carefully. We'll do a little bit more theorizing at the beginning of next lesson, but then we're going to get right down to analyzing one of the world's great archetypal fairy tales. We're going to take a long look at The Light Princess by George MacDonald. We'll talk about it. We'll show you, rather than theorizing, we'll show you in an actual fairy tale how it works. But I want to end with this quote today from G.K. Chesterton. It is absurd for the evolutionist to complain that it is unthinkable for an admittedly unthinkable God to make everything out of nothing. I mean, that's the way it is, right? The evolutionists, the materialists, the rationalists, those who argue that the system is closed, that there is nothing transcendent, that only material prison house exists, right? It is absurd for that man, the evolutionist, to complain that it is unthinkable for an admittedly unthinkable God to make everything out of nothing. That's the argument, right? When you talk about the possibility that the world, the universe, as vast as it is, was created, not random, the rationalist-minded man will say, it is absurd to imagine that some God who cannot be thought of because we have no empirical proof for him. It's absurd to imagine that some creator made the universe. It is unthinkable, right? For an admittedly, and those of us on our side, the fairy tale side, the God side, we know that God is unthinkable. We know that you can think about God, but you can't think him totally. That there is much about God that remains mystical, mythical, and unavailable to us. It is absurd for the evolutionist to complain that it is unthinkable for an admittedly unthinkable God to make everything out of nothing, but then that same evolutionist will turn around and argue and pretend that it is more thinkable that nothing should turn itself into everything. Which two is the more realistic statement? Which is the more fairy tale statement? Is it harder to believe that a omniscient God created all the order in the universe? Is that really harder to believe than the idea that absolute nothing would eventually somehow turn itself into absolute everything? And that's the difference between fairy tale and reality. When you phrase it that way, we on the fairy tale side, we on the God side, make a lot more logical sense. We'll see you next week.